first of all, thank you, Philip, for your time this evening. We really appreciate it. And for those who don't know Philip, he is a former colonel in British military intelligence and NATO. You've probably seen him on heaps of shows. Like you said, he was even on GB News earlier. And he's a full-time journalist and regular presenter on Sky News, BBC, and everywhere. So I'm going to hand it over to Philip now, and he's going to present to us his viewpoint on Ukraine from last year to now. We may have the odd natural break, and feel free to ask questions in the chat as we go, so I can pick those up. And and we're hoping that there's time at the end, so we can bring people on screen, so we can get a proper conversation going about how this is affecting us and our wargaming community, and what impact this is going to have going forwards. So, Philip, thank you, and I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you very much indeed for inviting me to come and speak. I'm going to do this share screen bit and see if that works more, and it should also be share computer sound. Yeah, that's the thing I needed to tick. And I've got slides that are by way of just background to set things on. That's the introductory bit. You were going to do your introduction whenever I had that up. Do you want me just to go on from there?
That's fine, you can crack on.
Brilliant. And thank you very much indeed, everyone, for coming along. I'll start off with a little bit about me as we come in. I'm going to intersperse me talking with bits of video of me doing stuff and all the rest of it, so you know a bit of the background, but you're not just getting boring me from my little home office as we go through things. What am I going to touch on this evening? In rough outline terms, the stuff that you can see on the screen there. There will be places to stop in it. So if you've got any questions, fire them in. You know, we'll take these natural breaks as we go through, because this is all about debate, and you know, I'd far rather be debating than and answering questions than talking to you the whole way through. And then I think there'll be plenty of talk time at the end as we get through things. So who am I? 26 years. First 12 years I was REME, then transferred across the Intelligence Corps. Left as a full colonel in 2010. Was in headquarters ARC on many occasions as a ground planner and other bits and pieces. I keynote speak across the world at the minute with my journalist hat on, having fallen into journalism by accident and taken over and run a business-to-business publication in the security area before striding out myself, and talk about the power of information, cyber security with a global twist, hacking your serotonin, which is always a good one, and other things. And you can find those on my website. It'll come up at the end. The indications on the hair that's there, grey hair media. It's a play on this stuff and the color that it is. And I dip my fingers in any pie that will pay at the end of the day, which is what we have to do on Civvy Street, because the government doesn't pay things at the end of the day. So a little bit about me. What's some of the stuff that I've done? Short little showreel video just to give you a flavor of some of the things I've been involved in. And this doesn't touch on Ukraine yet, because I haven't put any of my Ukraine stuff into it, and I'll just let you watch and listen to this.
Contained within that shell.
Find that needle in the haystack.
The most likely route is that someone during his walk through Salisbury has brushed past him and wiped this on his skin.
It could have been a poison or a toxin that was ingested in. They are fast acting.
Ingested, was it air?
And it only requires the tiniest of doses.
If something that's significant because it happened on the day of the murder has been missed, then we have to ask the question, what else could have been missed? And again, I hope we see this reflected in statements out of the UK Secretary of State for Defence. Well, that's significant because we'd have expected someone to try and claim responsibility on the day of the murder and soon afterwards.
Hello and welcome to The Moment with me, Maxine Mawhinney. Philip, what was your moment?
Maxine, my moment goes back to 2005.
Joined by Philip Ingram, who's a former intelligence officer and security expert, joining me from Birmingham. Thank you very much for joining us here on TRT World. So, as we said...
You're listening to The Inquiry on the BBC World Service with me, Helena Merriman.
You get issued your chemical protection kit. It goes with you
Joining me now is Phil Ingram, a security intelligence expert. Good evening, Phil. Thanks for coming in.
Security intelligence expert Philip Ingram has agreed to show me how.
Right. Thank you very much for that, Philip Ingram, a chemical weapons expert there, talking to us from Birmingham. Thanks.
So, Minister, thank you for talking to us. How important is the UK security market to you?
It's incredibly important. We are one of the best security exporters in the world.
For Brigitte, thank you very much indeed for talking to us. We're very fortunate at Interpol World Television to have the Secretary General of Interpol, Jürgen Stock, with us this afternoon. Is really of great concern. Hello, Kenobi. Thank you very much indeed for agreeing to chat. Can you tell us a little bit about what your role is within the security industry?
Welcome to View from the Bomb. Welcome to episode 19 of the With Ingram series of podcasts. I'm Philip Ingram.
Within that shell.
A little flavour of me. I deliberately put lots of media clips in there because I think one of the most important things one of the important things that we'll discuss, I hope, today is the importance of media and where it comes in and understanding how the different outlets work and everything else. And I'm comfortable in front or behind the camera or on the radio, and I write a lot into mainstream and business-to-business security press as well. But we're not here to talk about me. We're here to talk about Ukraine. And today we're coming to the end of day 364 of Vladimir Putin's 10-day special military operation. It's looking at how he's got to day 364 of what should have been something relatively short. It's important, I think, we put this into a little bit of historical context, and I'm not going to give a great history lesson here, but the furthest I want to go back is 1954, because that brings Crimea in, and Crimea is going to be a real sticking point when it comes to whatever solution is going to come out around it as we get towards the end of the current conflict. And it was only ceded to Ukraine in 1954 because Khrushchev wanted to give a sign of solidarity to Ukraine and a sign of unity to emphasize Ukraine as an integral part of the Soviet Union and all one family. And a lot of this is dictating some of the ways that Vladimir Putin is thinking today. And of course, in more recent Ukrainian history, we all know the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. We forget it was 1986. I think 1986 was only a couple of years ago, but that's because of my grey hair and my memories are fading. It only seems like a couple of years ago, but Ukraine has been independent since 1991. And in 1994, it gave up its nuclear weapons. And one of the guarantors of its security alongside the United States was Russia. And that sort of puts into context in recent history the way that they will accept their responsibilities under international agreements. We had the Orange Revolution in 2004, which was the movement away from a more Russian-focused, or the start of the move away from a more Russian-focused government, which it took until 2014 before that was really pushed away. And 2014, of course, was the first Russian invasion of Ukraine with the almost bloodless, in fact, I think it was bloodless, annexation of Crimea and the creation of the two little statelets, which were effectively a creation of Russian intelligence, where they were trying to stir up anti-Ukrainian feelings and pro-Russian feelings amongst different oblasts across Ukraine, and only managed to get elements of two, which they then had to sort of gerrymander a little bit to try and create the problem that they had in the east, in the Donbass region. Ukrainian leadership was still very corrupt at that time. Typical Soviet-style or Russian-style corruption was rife through everything. And it was 2019 when Zelensky was elected quite by surprise, but effectively one of his major tickets was to try and root out corruption. That riled Vladimir Putin, because that to him was the red rag to the bull of Ukraine starting to become more Western focused, more EU focused, more potentially NATO focused, and moving further away from Putin's desire to regenerate the Soviet Union, but with him as kingpin. And that's when Putin started his real operations to try and bully Ukraine into not moving away as quickly, and led up to the reinvasion on the 24th of February 2022. Putin had been working in Ukraine for quite some time. His information operation really started back in 2003, whenever he started to put an awful lot of commentary out about where Ukraine was going, and where Ukraine fitted into things. And he called the Ukrainians in 2003 Little Russians. He did that for two reasons, or there were two meanings to his use of the phrase Little Russians. One was he wanted to try and suggest that Ukrainians were Russians, and part of the Russian people, and didn't deserve to have their own separate identity. The second one was he was doing it in a slightly demeaning way. Yes, they were Russians, but they were second-class Russians. They weren't proper Russians from Russia. That's something maybe we want to have a look at and debate a little bit more later on. But the historical context is interesting. I think the most important bit is that Crimean piece. The next bit I want to get onto, and this is something that when we are looking at the wargaming side of things and the things that come out, it's asking ourselves the question as to how we got it so wrong, whenever the commentary at the very beginning was all about the military imbalance. That commentary led to, leaders of some very large countries, Olaf Scholz in Germany turning around and basically expecting the Russians to walk all over Ukraine in a number of days, and therefore, it was sensible from him. And Francois Macron in France almost said the same: just to sit in your hands and do nothing, let Russia do that, and we'll sort the mess out afterwards. Once they've captured the rest of Ukraine in a bloodless way, like they did with Crimea. And the figures, the numbers would have suggested that that's what should have happened. And those numbers that are up there from global firepower are fairly accurate, but this is looking at totality of numbers on the ground, whether it be numbers of personnel, numbers of pieces of equipment. But what it doesn't take into account, and I think this is something that I'll explore as we go through this, are the real factors that influence how a conflict and how the fighting power of a force is generated, and what the important things are in it. And whenever I talk to the press about this, I turn around and say we shouldn't underestimate the resolve of the people, because warfare at the end of the day is a very human activity, enabled by equipment, enabled by weapons, enabled by poor diplomacy, poor policy, and everything else. But it's a human effort, and behind that is the resolve, the training, the understanding, the moral component of fighting power. And I'm not sure how in a wargaming scenario you manage to get that moral component of fighting power and get it reflected. I remember as a planner in Headquarters ARC, the operational analysis branch, which did all our wargaming for us, or talked us through the wargaming that we needed to do, had all the algorithms for this. But I don't think we ever got an algorithm for that, or whether we got it right or not. And at the end of the day, the Ukrainians are fighting for the survival of their nation, the survival of their families. And most of the Russians across the border didn't know where they were going and what they were doing. When it comes to pieces of equipment, numbers game is brilliant, but what that doesn't take into account is the serviceability of the equipment, the spare support there is within it, the training of the personnel to know how they can operate it, or not just operate it, is to fight it. And then when you look at the different equipments coming together, it's understanding that complexity of the combined arms operation, of high intensity warfare, and all of the components that bring into that. And I think part of the reason why, and I'm going to show my age here, why we and many analysts got it wrong, and senior generals and all the rest of it got it wrong in looking at it, is what I call the Genforce factor. Because I know generic enemy has changed a lot across defense at the moment, but post Cold War, as we moved on, when we went into war fighting, high intensity war fighting, there was the Big Red book or the big pink pillow, which was the generic enemy force, which was based on what the Russians would have liked to have been with their forces in 2025. And their equipment always worked. It was always the most modern. Their tactics and their doctrine always worked as well, and they understood it and could fight it to the greatest ability. They understood combined arms operations at the highest level. They could execute them extremely well at the lower tactical levels. Their weapon systems always worked out to maximum range, and reliability was always good. Their ability to carry out complex all-arms operations such as meeting engagements and all the rest of it outsmarted anything that we could do. And this was all in the doctrine of the Genforce pillow. But because it was all in a book, it meant that when it came to exercising, training and everything else, our senior G3, G5, J3, J5 staff actually didn't need to be fed with real intelligence, because after a few exercises, everyone knew what the capabilities were and where they could come. So senior commanders would make their own minds up. It helped that they had written the exercise as well, so knew what the next serial would be and what the outcomes would be. But this has led to, I think, a level of groupthink that there has been throughout our military planning forces and military understanding that led to part of the reason why we got this wrong, because it's our military personnel that would have briefed our politicians, and I think it's not just within the UK, but it's across all NATO countries, including the United States. We got our analysis of Russia's capability badly wrong. We've also since let the defense industrial base start to dictate what the weapon systems are that are needed to defeat any potential enemy weapon system. And this is something we could potentially debate later on, because what we're proving now is and this might not be the right terminology, but the block 1 N law with a single warhead is able to defeat the most advanced Russian T-90 tanks, whereas the manufacturer Thales was turning around to the Ministry of Defense and saying, oh no, it's not going to be able to defeat the latest tank. You need the Block 2 with a tandem warhead, and this is how much more it's going to cost. How much money have we spent over the years in buying weapon systems that fantastically overmatch the threat that's out there? That's good because it means that we're future-proofing everything, but is it good from an economic perspective? Question. Another little bit, apologies, this is GB News, and the presenter in this is, I'll reserve my thoughts on them in case any of his mates are in the
It's so interesting because it does feed into all these stereotypes about Russia that we have, that they really like the big displays of strength. But when it comes to the particular, the detail, the maintenance, and indeed, frankly, the cash, let's not forget the Russian economy is about the same size as the Spanish economy, and yet they've tried to maintain this Soviet-style military. Are they sort of playing with a bit of a facade here?
Oh, complete facade, and clearly Putin has believed the facade himself, that his forces are more capable than they are. Something like that looks fantastic on a parade in Red Square, where it has to travel a total about 3 kilometres reliably, but to try and take it into those sorts of conditions in a combat environment where the Ukrainians are putting up such a sterling defence that they're forcing the organisations to have to try and deploy off-road to take different routes, otherwise they're getting killed, but they're killing themselves by getting stuck.
Although, are we being a bit Panglossian here? Are we being too optimistic? Because ultimately, the Russian troops are better equipped, even though their equipment is older, there's more of it, there are more of the Russians. They are going to win this fight in Ukraine, at least in the short term.
I'll start from the final bit. The Russians are not going to win. They have lost this. No matter what the outcome is, even if they capture all of the cities, they have lost it, because the Ukrainian people are fixed in the belief that they will resist until the very, very end. The paper analysis of saying the Russians have got 200,000 bits of this kit and the Ukrainians have only got 50,000 bits of this kit, therefore the Russians must win, missed the fact that actually of that 200,000 bits of this kit that the Russians have got, they can only man with experienced manpower that amount of it, they can only support logistically that amount of it, and they've only got people who are experienced in using military operations with that amount of it. So it could only be a very small amount. And the motivation of those that are maintaining it, that are operating it and all the rest of it, is completely different to the motivation of those on the Ukrainian side who are fighting for their national survival, fighting for the survival of their families. And warfare at the end of the day isn't all about kit. The human piece is as important, if not more important. And that motivation, that backbone that the Ukrainian defenders have is something that the Russians are suffering.
Now, we should know about this. If we remember the Falklands crisis 1982 and the attack on Goose Green, the attackers were outnumbered 3 to 1 at least by the defenders. Doctrinally, that was completely the wrong way around. So we keep forgetting about this human factor every now and again when it's commenting. The lessons that we can draw out of this are, it really is, it's the importance of that human factor. It's the necessity, I think, and if I had the ability to get in and advise the Minister of Defence, and I think after having done some commentary on GB News this afternoon about Ben Wallace, that I won't even be let anywhere near the front door of the Minister of Defence ever again. But if we're allowed to get in and advise the Minister of Defence, I think we should almost go back to the old Cold War days of where a lot of the decisions around kit, around structures, around what we needed to do were driven by the outputs that were coming from defence intelligence. It was an intelligence lead, understanding the threat and understanding what we needed to counter that dictated what our latest pieces of equipment should be and what our latest structures should be to try and defeat that, and how we should move. Again, this is something that we could potentially look at. I don't know whether we want to have any chat around that at the moment before I go on. I'll take that as a...
No, that's really interesting. I was just unmuting. Thank you, Philip. And I think, we won't be mean to GB News anymore. They're another news outlet and it's important that we have the most views possible. But we have got some comments in the chat. Does anybody that's commented so far wish to raise their hand to ask a question for Philip at the moment? No, we're good. You crack on.
Right, I'll crack on then. Good.
Yeah.
We'll keep them at the end.
Philip, sorry, I raised my hand too late.
No, that's okay.
Just on the topic of what we're saying there with or what you were saying in terms of, we've consistently overestimated the Russian military in both training scenarios and just in general, the kind of everyone believed the thing of the Great Russian Bear.
Yeah.
But obviously 2020 hindsight, we shouldn't have bought into the hype as much as we did, but simultaneously to that, surely there's value in overestimating a potential adversary rather than underestimating. So I suppose it's better to, well, what's your thoughts on kind of yes, we overestimated, but surely
I agree completely. It's far better to overestimate. It's the impact that it has, though, is whenever we are having issues with wider defence budgets and bits and pieces, and it's making sure that what we're spending our budget on is for what we need, but what we need in against a threat that's going to be 3 years, 5 years, 8 years down the line, depending on when the length of time it takes to get the procurement cycle going through in a war footing and all the rest of it. So it's a very difficult decision to make. It's something that worked very well during the Cold War, and I don't know how many Cold War warriors that there are out there, but the defense intelligence, the technical intelligence staff and defense intelligence would produce fantastic outputs, and a lot of that was based on stuff that again with Cold War we had the BRICS teams going around in East Germany and effectively nicking bits of kit or climbing into it and getting pictures of it. So there's very good human intelligence backing technical intelligence and backing everything else to get a proper understanding of what the threat was. And we had probably a single threat actor then, so it was much more simple, and we didn't have all of these operations like we've had in Afghanistan and Iraq and the Balkans upsetting our equipment programs and our priorities, and therefore interfering with budgets. So it's a hugely more complex period of time, and you're 100% right. Always better to overestimate than underestimate. It did cost us money, and we're probably paying for that at the moment in some of our other equipment programs.
Cool, thanks for your question, Dan. Phil, would you like to crack on?
I'll crack on. Right, so 4th of January last year, I was watching everything that was going on and was pretty certain that the Russians were on the cusp of making the decision to come across and properly attack into Ukraine. They beforehand had carried out exercises around the outside of Ukraine, threatening to come in on a couple of occasions, but there'd never been any indication to suggest there was outloading of wartime levels of ammunition stocks, the movement of key indicators like medical facilities forward basing of troops and all the rest of it. So I stick my old planning hat on and tried to work out what the art of the probable was for what the Russians would do. And I thought that what they would do was to try and have their main effort coming in from the east to try and take the whole of the disputed Donbass region and possibly go right up to the edge of the Dnieper River, take more than they needed so that they could negotiate back again to take the Donbass and create that land bridge that they feel was so important between Crimea and Russia itself. In doing that, I thought they'd carry out a number of diversionary exercises to diversionary operations, to split the Ukrainian defense. The main one being a diversionary into to attack Kyiv, and possibly another seaborne operation into attack Odessa in the south. And then I started to put a series of indicators and warnings together that over the coming days and weeks, I started to put little red ticks beside them, and you can see those at the side of this. About 2 weeks, about 10 days beforehand, I wrote a sort of quick outline of a potential up plan, saying at approximately 0400 local, possibly 20x of February. I wasn't far off when it hit the 24th of February, and that actually happened. But again, it was describing this up plan. I didn't think that the Russians were configured enough to carry out a very complex operation into Kyiv, and I hadn't assessed that their objective would be to immediately topple the Zelensky government. I thought they would take a big chunk of territory and hope that in the way democracy worked in Ukraine, or what they could influence, that in itself would topple Zelensky for having given it away. And Zelensky was himself making enough noises to suggest that he didn't really want to upset the Russians. Why did Putin decide to go in at this time? Well, I think his decision to attack this time was based on a number of factors. One of the biggest factors was the debacle of the Western withdrawal, or the Western ejection from Afghanistan. And he saw the way we were licking our wounds militarily, having been thrown out by a ragtag bunch of Taliban, and how we got our estimates so wrong. And he thought that politically, the United States, the UK, and wider Europe was wounded enough by that we wouldn't be interested. He also will have taken into account the fact that we did virtually nothing after the 2014 capture of Crimea, and a number of other factors that were coming in. He was testing political resolve by making very strong statements out across the United Nations and elsewhere, and seeing what the reaction would be in various capitals around the world. And the readout that he will have had from his intelligence staffs and the rest of his staffs was sort of, the rest of the world is sort of, nonplussed about what might happen in Ukraine. So he made the decision to go. He got that wrong. So Putin's actual main effort in his 10-day special military operation, and I keep bringing that phrase out when I talk on Sky, because I think he genuinely thought that this was all going to be over within 10 days to 2 weeks, and he'd be having a victory parade inside Kyiv. How wrong was Vladimir Putin? Now, you wouldn't expect Ex-Incore not to come up with the maps with all the map symbols and all the rest of it. I'm assuming that, as this is a wargaming audience, this is almost map pornography, and everyone knows exactly what's going on and everything else. But the interesting thing is, this was sort of about a week afterwards, into the 7th of March, the Russian attack into Kyiv was actually very sophisticated. The Ukrainian defense, with everything that's going on, we get little information out from open source on how the Ukrainians are configured and how they're defending, and for OPSEC reasons. But a lot of this has been checked and estimated afterwards. Simplifying it, we've effectively got the Russians putting special forces into Kyiv, first of all. A lot of them were FSB intelligence services, but there are also a lot of GRU working in there, trying to identify where Zelensky was, trying to identify the key buildings, to bring in the air mobile and airborne forces to properly capture it. And if they could have secured them beforehand, they would have done. One of the things that helped the Ukrainians survive this was they'd been provided intelligence by Western intelligence for weeks and months beforehand. And the Western intelligence was of a very high granularity and was being fed in the whole way through. So the Ukrainians were prepared for what the Russians were going to do. And luckily the Ukrainians believed the intelligence, because even when it was shared with some EU countries, the EU leaders refused to accept that it was accurate in any way, shape or form, because they didn't think the Russians were actually going to do this. So the operation was the special Russian SOF to try and disrupt and to secure key areas and key personnel within Kyiv, an air mobile operation to capture the Antonov airport to the northwest of Kyiv, and that was quite a sophisticated air mobile operation to get in there, to be able to hold that for a maximum of 24 hours before they would then have reinforced it with quite large numbers of parachute forces coming in, to then secure that and the main routes into Kyiv itself, to allow that to be met up with an armored heavy land force coming in to properly secure and surround and make sure that the Ukrainians couldn't counterattack it. Meanwhile, they'll have expected to have secured Zelensky, secured the government, taken over the television outlets and all the rest of it, and declared a new government in a very short operation. There are unconfirmed reports that a number of the Russian troops in their vehicles and things were coming down with their dress uniforms. I don't know whether this is just information operations, but it would fit with the planning of what was going to go on already for the parade in Kyiv, where there would be a puppet government brought in, and they would declare their loyalty to Vladimir Putin and to Russia, and Ukraine would become a puppet state like Belarus is with Lukashenko. Oh dear, it didn't happen quite that way. Meanwhile, going on through the rest of Ukraine, again, the map porn for those who like it. I prefer to simplify things, and as when in the press, you have to keep it simple. A map with some colors on it makes it easy, but the red and orange bits are where the Russians were making some massive advances. They'd taken a lot of territory to get down to Kyiv. That territory was really quite difficult to carry out maneuver operations through, and they were taking a lot of territory again around Chernihiv and that northern part. The Ukrainians were caught in a bit of a dilemma. They were trying to work out how much was going to come into Kyiv and how they could hold them back, and were carrying out some quite sophisticated operations then. But that meant that what they were having to do was give up some territory in that southeastern part, around Mariupol and Kherson and elsewhere. They were doing the effective trading space for time, and that time was allowing them to try and slow the Russian advances down, defeat the Russian main effort into around Kyiv, and work out what they're going to do next by stimulating greater support from the international community. And so a mix of tactical operations to try and affect Russia's strategic effort and their strategic operations to try and get the level of support that they knew that they would need to properly go on and start to push the Russians back at some stage in the future. So what happened? How did the plan fall apart? Well, the SOF operations inside Kyiv, the Russian SOF operations didn't quite work because they had been compromised beforehand, and Ukrainian intelligence and Ukrainian security forces managed to fix or capture a lot of the SOF that were there, or push them out. They ran away and they went up to Antonov airport. The air mobile operation getting into Antonov airport, a number of the helicopters were shot down and interdicted by Ukrainian air defense that had been forward deployed, because they'd been pre-warned that there'd been the build-up and this was coming in. troops got onto the ground. The troops hadn't expected to meet resistance, and they met quite a strong resistance that managed to fix them into the airport. And there was heavy fighting around the airport for a few days before they got defeated. It lasted a few days because the paratroopers that were supposed to be coming in didn't make it. There were at least two within 36 hours of the operation. There were at least two Antonov aircraft shot down with the Russians' most advanced paratroopers in it, taking out at least 600 to 800 paratroopers. That would have made all of that difference in capturing the airfield. And then because of the time of the year, the fact that the ground wasn't frozen, and the fact that maneuver off main routes was virtually impossible, it made the Ukrainian defense of the two main routes into Kyiv from the north and from that northeast bit easy for them to interdict. What they did was they destroyed a couple of vehicles at the front of the convoys that were coming in, destroyed a couple of vehicles at the back, and destroyed a couple of vehicles in the middle. And the Russians were configured in a way that they couldn't get their recovery troops down. They were in one great big long line, and we had that 40-kilometer convoy that seemed to last for weeks and weeks and weeks. That was just fixed, and it allowed the Ukrainians to sit and pick them off whenever they could. And it allowed very light forces to be able to maneuver very quickly with sophisticated anti-armor weapons to have a massive effect in destroying the Russian capability. And they culminated within a matter of days and not able to carry out this mission and got fixed, allowing the Ukrainians then to move on and work out what the next phase of the operation was. So what went wrong with their main effort? Well, the Russians underestimated the resolve that the Ukrainians were going to be, the Ukrainians had, underestimated the advance notice that the Ukrainians had of what the Russians were going to do, underestimated the Ukrainian defenses. They overestimated their own ability to carry out complex maneuver operations, including air mobile operations. They overestimated their command and control. They overestimated their logistic ability. And you know, all of that and the final thing they got wrong was their moral component of the fighting power with their personnel, and all of that led to the disaster. And this has then gone on to a number of major operations between then and now. So February to April 22 was Kyiv and northern Ukraine, with the Mariupol, Severodonetsk, and the Shank operation that running from May to July, as things got pushed further east and the Russians withdrew from their Kyiv operation onto the north, licking their wounds. They then started to focus from August on Bakhmut and the operations coming out of Bakhmut, with that being led by the Wagner private military company and Prigozhin. I'll talk more about him a little later when it comes to command and control, but he was a direct friend of Vladimir Putin, and this was Putin turning around to him and saying, the army have cocked up all of this, you take over and get me some success in that eastern part. That is still ongoing today, some 7.5, almost 8 months. The Russian attack into around Bakhmut has been effectively fixed. Ukrainians weren't hanging around. August, the significant piece of equipment that came in around August, around that sort of time, was the HIMARS and the MLRS M270s, giving the Ukrainians the ability to hit at long range very accurately Russian command and control logistic bases and have a proper effect on the battlefield. Those systems alongside 155mm artillery. Artillery is the key enabler in a lot of the operations that are here. So we then get the Ukrainians counterattack. The Kharkiv counteroffensive went very quickly indeed from September, and managed to capture in 2 days what took the Russians almost 2 months to capture and push them out by taking a big chunk of territory there. And the Kherson counteroffensive had started and was working more slowly. That went on until towards the end of October, when the Russian commander the new Russian commander then, Surovikin, had realized that he couldn't maintain his troops on the western side of the Dnipro, and made the correct military decision, I believe, to withdraw them back over that rather than lose them completely, giving the Ukrainians the ability to capture Kherson, now recapture Kherson back again, which was the first and only major city that they had to give up to the Russians in the first place. So significant operations, and since then, effectively, we have hit a stalemate where the Ukrainians are, I think, fixing the Russians in the Bakhmut area and along the front line, with no further advances by the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians have been stopping the Russians from advancing across and taking any of the territory back. I'll talk more of the potential spring offensive that we keep hearing about in a second. The intelligence game. This has been critical to the successes that the Ukrainians have got. And I've put a few slides here of virtually what is flying on a daily basis, giving intelligence, bringing the national levels of intelligence together, the NATO levels of intelligence together, and then fusing that in a way that it can be given to the Ukrainians. There have been some very significant intelligence reports put out. Before the Ukrainians actually started, the Americans put out some very sensitive intelligence describing what the Russians were going to do. Olaf Scholz refused to believe it, but it was giving the warning of the attack that's going in. The Americans only this week at the, last week at the Munich Security Conference, whenever they put their warning out to China to say, don't get involved directly, that will have been based on very sensitive intelligence saying that we know exactly what you're doing and the decision-making and how the decision-making is going on with regard to potentially supplying weapons and other military material into the Russians. So please don't do it, because if you do, we'll know about it. Flying on a daily basis, we've got everything from AWACS. The whole of the border is patrolled by the NATO border is patrolled by a NATO combat air patrols, but we've got AWACS providing that air picture. We've got measurement and signature intelligence capabilities, whether they be the Global Hawk or the Italian aircraft or J-Stars. Flying around, giving us very detailed pictures of what is deployed, where it's deployed, and what has changed, combined with massive signals intelligence platforms indicated here by the rivet joint, and that's an RAF rivet joint. But all of these are complementing the space-based programs that are there. So these have got a degree of visibility over the land bit, and this is an unclassified view of the sorts of reach that they've got. The classified view of where they can get to and what's going on would be slightly more impressive, is all I can say on that matter. But it's complementing what's coming out of space, and it's going on virtually 24/7. What you can pick up on a lot of the open source aircraft monitoring platforms like Flight Radar 24 or ADSB or others, a lot of this is openly flying, and you can see it, you can plot it, and you look at it on a daily basis. The level of granularity that that gives is phenomenal, right down to, in many cases, individual vehicle locations and where individual vehicles are moving, and the distinction between whether those vehicles are tracked or whether those vehicles are wheeled, whether those vehicles are civilian, or whether those vehicles are military in their output. Combine that with the sophisticated weapon systems that have been supplied into the Ukrainians. That is why they're having a massive effect on Russian logistics, on Russian command and control, and elsewhere. And the intelligence game combined with indirect fire, whether it be through missile systems or through artillery systems, is a significant player within this particular conflict, and I would argue within any conflict that there is in the future. But it's all about people. I go back to people, and I don't apologize for re-emphasizing the bit on people. I don't know if anyone wants to jump in and ask any questions to where we are at the minute before I talk a little bit more about the people.
I mean, we've got some questions specifically on different forces and special forces going in, but I think we can get to those at the end, not on the people stuff. So,
yeah, not a problem. I'll crack on. Another bit of me talking.
Oh, let's get more on this now. Philip Ingram is with me, a former senior military intelligence and security officer. So, Philip, this is interesting. Changes at the very top of the military command involved in this war in Ukraine. Who are now the key players? What does this change mean?
It is. Well, we have to remember this is day 323 of Vladimir Putin's 10-day special military operation, and he's at the top of the tree. You know, he is in overall command, but it seems that he's increasingly distrusting his military commanders because he's reaching down with what we call the long screwdriver right into the tactical battles and ordering some things around and making tactical decisions. His right-hand man politically is his Minister of Defence, General Shoigu, 67 years old. He's been Minister of Defence since 2012. He was part of the planning for the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and part of the planning for this special military operation.
Let's talk about this reshuffle. Who are the military commanders in that?
Well, as you touched in there, General Gerasimov, who is the Chief of the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces, has just been given the additional title of the Commander of the Joint Group of Troops. So he's overall responsible for everything that's going on inside Ukraine. It's not clear whether he's giving up his other post or this is an additional post. 67 years old, he's a Putin ally. He's been in major decision-making roles militarily since the Chechen Wars of 1999, so obviously involved in planning this special military operation and Crimea in 2014. He's pushed aside General Surovikin, the youngest of all of the generals that are in there. He's only 56. He's an Air Force general, nicknamed General Armageddon because of what he did inside Syria. But he's now one of 3 deputies that exist to Gerasimov. But he was appointed in October. Since then, he oversaw the withdrawal of Russian troops from Kherson, the disastrous attack from a Russian perspective, a fantastic attack from a Ukrainian perspective on New Year's Day at Kyiv, where a large number of Russian troops were killed. And he's been the master of the suicide drone attacks onto critical national infrastructure in Ukraine.
As you said, Surovikin has only been in the position for 3 months. He's now been moved aside, if you like. Is this common? Should we read much into it, this reshuffle?
There's a lot of angst going on inside the command and control structure. Putin has lost control, and he's being influenced by this final character that there is in here, who is Prigozhin. And Prigozhin is the head of the Wagner Group, this private military company that comes in. He's got political ambitions, or we're starting to get indications he has, to potentially be Putin's successor, but he's got a direct line into Putin. And he has openly criticised Shoigu and Gerasimov for what they've been doing. And when people openly criticise what they've been doing militarily, they tend to fall out of a window from the 9th floor or fall down the stairs. He hasn't, which shows that he's got that protection from Putin. Interestingly, he has praised Surovikin. So this dynamic and this relationship, whenever, from a military perspective, he's doing all the stuff in Bakhmut at the moment, or his troops are, he should be under Gerasimov. He's not. And where he's fitting in and the way he's stirring the pot is, I think, causing people real angst.
OK, Philip, thank you. Running us through some of the key... Oh, let's get...
Right, so all about people. And the key ones that are in there are Putin's relationship with Prigozhin, that is deteriorating. And he's trying to push him to one side by putting Gerasimov in as the overall commander. Gerasimov should be in charge of Prigozhin, but Prigozhin has been openly critical of him and of Shoigu in a lot of the decisions that are going on. Interestingly, Prigozhin and Surovikin were working very closely together, and Prigozhin actually praised Surovikin's decision-making whilst he was in charge of operations in Ukraine. So he is the sort of the Wagner private military company plant that there is in there. And this is turning into now Prigozhin is complaining that the Russian military are not providing him the artillery ammunition and indirect fire support that he had enjoyed beforehand. Surovikin was giving him all of the support that he needed whenever he needed it in the operations around in Bakhmut. But this doesn't bode well whenever you haven't got a clear unity of command for those commanders that are operating on the ground. And you've got at the higher levels, the frictions that are in there. if you can't get that higher level of command right and planning right, and Gerasimov is a traditional military man. He's trying to get things done in a more in a way that we'd recognize as a traditional military approach, and that would improve things on the ground. But with this friction that there is there, that will not give him the time to try and fix his lower level commanders who have been found wanting, to put it mildly, up until now. So I think this dynamic that's here is critical as to where the war is going to go. This comes into the people that there are around in Putin's wider inner circle. We see the Shoigu and Gerasimov in the top left there, but we've got on the political side Lavrov, who is dealing with the wider international community and will say anything that's there. We've got the intelligence agencies and the FSB and the SVR sitting in the background, and Putin thinks he understands what they're doing, and he will bring them close when he needs to, and then push them away and insult them when he feels that they're getting too close and getting too powerful. And Putin is the kingpin master at playing each of those that are in his inner circle. And the whole of his inner circle there are forming sort of the little blobs around the outside, with Putin in the middle here as the kingpin. The way Putin's got it designed is such that any of the little blobs on the outside, if they overstretch themselves a little bit too far, and he doesn't like where they're going, and there's more than just the ones that were on the picture there, they tend to have a heart attack next Saturday, or, as I said earlier, take up window cleaning from the 9th floor and forget that the window's open, or fall down the stairs. And we keep hearing a number of reports of individuals and that happening to them all over the world, and that's creates fear amongst that inner group that if anyone is a dissenter, they may be called out by anyone else because they don't know who they can trust and who they can't trust. And if they do get called out, that's the end of it for them. The person that's holding it all together is Vladimir Putin. The trouble is, if Putin goes, then there isn't a natural successor. That's the way he's designed it. And without that natural successor, you're then going to get amongst some very power-hungry individuals a lot of in-house fighting for someone to take power, because that central position is kingpin. That makes everyone else multi-billionaires and makes the person in the center a multi-billionaire, and everything that's going on. Money drives everything. The trouble is, if that happens, the most powerful people that'll get in are intelligence services and elsewhere, but you've got the likes of Prigozhin from Wagner, who's got the military power potentially to come and take things over. Some of them are more hardline than Vladimir Putin. Some of them are the ones that have come up with the Nazification excuse in Ukraine to go in and all the rest of it. So there's almost in here, as we get towards the end of this, a better the devil you know than the devil you don't in what we're dealing with in trying to solve this. However, at the end of it, when Putin loses and the Russians are pushed out, and I will quite happily say when, that will mean that Putin will almost certainly fall in the center there, unless he can Teflon coat himself a little bit more. If he does go, it'll stimulate the in-house fighting. If that happens, well, I'll touch on that at the end. We're not that far off it at the moment. People need resources and kit. International communities come together. We all see the daily press outputs as to what's coming on, but putting into context, the actual contributions that have been made from the United States. If it wasn't for the United States that's in here, things would be completely different on the ground. The US politically is not one speaking with one voice. They're very much split between Democratic and Republican Party views on this, and the Republican Party is not as enamored at supporting Zelensky and the Ukrainians as they're sitting in opposition. Whether they would continue the support if they got into power again next time is unclear, but they now have the majority in one of the houses. And this is going to make Biden's task slightly more difficult domestically in getting equipment and money and all the rest of it through to Zelensky, but he seems to be writing blank checks at the moment and is being allowed to cash them. Part of the reason why he's being allowed to cash them is that the big winners out of all of this are the defense industrial base, the domestic defense industries and all the rest of it, who will be making billions, and their influence in the United States is huge. EU, major contributor. Military aid, the UK is amongst the second biggest contributor. What this doesn't put into context is that we've actually been supporting Ukraine and its development militarily for many, many, many years. You know, I went through the first Advanced Command and Staff College course whilst it was a Bracknell before they'd even cut the first sod at Shrivenham to build the Joint Staff College there. And that was when the first Ukrainian staff officer came along, and he was Ukrainian Air Force, an individual called Valery Vublyov, and he had been pre-briefed beforehand by Ukrainian intelligence that British intelligence would try to approach him and to turn him round, and he was to say nothing, not talk to any intelligence officers, not do anything else, because they would try and turn him into a spy. And who was he sat beside in his first syndicate and day one, term one? He was sat beside me. It took about 2 weeks before he would actually say good morning to me. By the end of the course, we were best mates and having a really good time. But getting his insights was fascinating. But since 1996, the UK has been training the Ukrainians in complex maneuver operations and how to plan them, execute them, and all the rest of it. We've also been replicating that training much later on the ground and ground maneuver and training with Western weapons and everything else. So if it wasn't for that, I don't think the Ukrainians would be as prepared as they are today for things that are going on. And a lot of other countries have contributed to that as well. Another little bit of...
Well, joining me now to discuss this in a bit more detail, former Senior Intelligence and Security Officer Philip Ingram. So, Philip, let's start by talking about the tanks. It's getting all the headlines. What are the latest on the discussions about donating these Leopard 2s? It is. Well, the discussions are going on day 334 of Vladimir Putin's 10-day military operation, and we're still talking about Leopard 2s. Chancellor Scholz's spokesperson has said today there's been no official inquiry from those other European nations that have Leopard 2 tanks and they say they want to transfer them, in particular Poland and Finland. And I think Poland and Finland want to get a coalition where Germany actually...
Oh, sorry. That seemed to have stopped. I'll take it.
Well, joining me now to discuss this in a bit, the fact that some countries are willing to hand them over. Germany, it remains to be seen. We thought that decision would be taken Friday at that big meeting of foreign ministers, but it didn't happen. When should we expect to see some of these tanks arrive in Ukraine? Because Volodymyr Zelensky has reminded the West countless times that time is of the essence, essentially.
It is, but there's no point in the tanks getting into Ukraine until their crews are ready to use them and operate them. And putting it into context, and it's slightly different, but the British Challenger 2 and the Ukrainians have already started, or are starting this week, to be trained in Challenger 2. If you take a newly trained British Army soldier and put him onto the standard course to teach them the basics of that, it's a 20-week course. Now, that's a peacetime course. It's going to be accelerated for the Ukrainians because they will send their most experienced tank crews in to learn about this. So that'll be compressed very quickly indeed. But not only do they have to learn to operate the tank, those maintainers need to learn how to maintain it, and then they need to learn how to fight it with other tanks and with other infantry fighting vehicles and other bits and pieces. So it's quite complex. So getting the tanks into Ukraine at the minute, we've got several weeks before the Ukrainians are even going to be in a position to operate them and use them. That gives plenty of time for this political machinations to be sorted out. Yeah.
Well, joining me now.
I'm going to say a little bit more on equipment and all the rest. There's an awful lot of commentary comes out the press where and politicians are saying, Boris Johnson said it only earlier this week with Liz Truss, that we should have given more equipment a lot earlier and we should just flow as much equipment into the Ukrainians as possible. The Ukrainians weren't ready for this and to get Western equipment, all the rest at the beginning of the operation. They needed to stop the Russian advance into Kyiv. They needed to push them back. They needed to get to a point where they could fix the Russians in place and hold them in place whilst attriting Russian maneuver, to give them the freedom to get experienced Ukrainian troops out to be trained in the new equipment and out of the battle space for up to 3 or 4 months, possibly, to get that trained. And it has taken most of the operation till now for the Ukrainians to be able to get the confidence that they can do that and get ready and into position to do that. So firing lots of Western equipment in very early would have done nothing but get Western equipment to a point where there'd be more dead hulks of it across the battle space because they wouldn't have been ready to operate it or to fight it in a coherent way. They're now getting ready to do that, I think. So where are we going next? Well, the Russians rechanged their main effort again. Is it sensible to change your main effort in the middle of an operation? And what are the implications of that? There's a philosophical discussion, and again, it's back to almost what it was that I was saying at the very beginning in January last year. Russian offensive operations a little bit.
The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has said that the situation on the front remains extremely acute, particularly in the eastern Donetsk region, where Russia appears to be stepping up an offensive. Well, joining me now for a closer look at what's happening on the ground is the former military intelligence security officer, Philip Ingram. Hello again to you, Philip. Just talk us through, by way of the helpful map that we're going to put on the screen, what is happening on the ground.
Well, taking a slightly bigger picture, if we look at Belarus, and that keeps coming into the commentary, Russia is using Belarus as a place to train those conscripts that we heard being called up and to try and match them up with pieces of equipment, put them into formations because they train them in the units that they want to fight, and then they're taking those formations and moving them around for this spring offensive that we keep hearing lots about. However, where the fighting is happening, the Russians are carrying out little probing attacks around Zaporizhia, artillery attacks further south than that, down to Kherson, and all along the red hatched line where the red dots are that we can see there, probing into the Ukrainian defences to see if there's any weak points that they can look at. Ukrainians are doing a little bit of probing back, but they're holding the Russians in a lot of places.
Yeah, talk us through what's happening on the counteroffensive.
Well, counteroffensive, we keep hearing of this spring offensive. The thing that will be important is the ground, whether the ground's solid enough for armoured formations to go through. But there's thinking in two potential Russian counteroffensives. And they'll want to do this before the Ukrainians get their hands on the Western tanks and infantry fighting vehicles that are coming in. And Putin tends to like anniversaries. So there's a possibility he might do this on exactly...
Oh, sorry. Don't know what's happened there.
Is the ground, whether the ground's solid enough for armoured formations to go through. But there's thinking in two potential Russian counteroffensives. And they'll want to do this before the Ukrainians get their hands on the Western tanks and infantry fighting vehicles that are coming in. And Putin tends to like anniversaries. So there's a possibility he might do this on exactly a year on. So towards the end of next month, 23rd, 24th, 25th of February, might try and do something. He's moved elements of 2nd Motor Rifle Division from Belarus, that's trained into the Lyshansk Oblast. And that gives them two options that people are talking about to counterattack through. One down through Veladar, that we can see south of Donetsk there, and come sweeping through that to try and push out and capture the rest of the Donetsk Oblast. But the other one is, and there's been fighting going on in this area for the last 6 months, through Bakhmut, and exploit any successes that he gets through there.
And just talk us through, we've been focusing a lot, haven't we, on Bakhmut the last few weeks.
I'll leave Bakhmut. The map as of yesterday, this was a map that had come out of Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, and looking at a number of different directions of attack that could be coming through from the Russians. They're probing everywhere still. I think there's a little bit of confusion as to whether their spring offensive has actually started, because the probing is happening with relatively small formations, and there has been no accurate reporting on larger manoeuvre formation sitting behind it. And in fact, the UK Ministry of Defence Intelligence has questioned whether the Russians have the ability to generate larger manoeuvre forces to be able to exploit anything that's there. If they can't do that, that means they're in a worse position than we had thought beforehand. If they do that, the Ukrainians may be forced to give up a little bit of ground to buy time for them to get their defences. The Ukrainians have prepared layered defences the whole way back. Interestingly, so have the Russians. So the Russians are anticipating some Ukrainian counteroffensives. One of the questions that we have to ask with regard to this, as the Russians prepare for a counteroffensive, have they actually fixed any of the things that went wrong in the first place, that stopped them from capturing Kyiv and having further successes elsewhere? If we look at the things that were wrong, it's the morale of their troops. Have they managed to fix that? Answer, no. How they manage to fix their logistics so that they can get the logistics to where it needs to be at the right time, and properly support combat operations? Answer is no. Have they fixed their command and control? Have they been able to enable more junior commanders to make decisions on the ground to be able to exploit things? Answer is no. Have they managed to fix their higher level of planning and so that they can do things? Started to. Gerasimov has managed to change a few things, but he's fixed in his own little battles with Prigozhin and his little political battles. So I don't think they've managed to fix anything in any significant way that can get things done. Are they working from a joint perspective? Answer, not really. So they haven't managed to fix anything that was broken beforehand. Are they likely to have any further success now? I would argue probably not. Ukrainian potential counteroffensives, when they get the equipment, we saw them take the two, and it's in blue there, the two big bites of territory back again off the Russians. I think they'll do two things once they get the Western equipment again. They will try something to take another big bite of territory back, and that could be that more northern blue arrow into that the northern area, grab the territory back there again, before then launching a more decisive attack down, possibly through Zaporizhia, keeping the Dnipro on the right flank and heading down to Mariupol on the coast and splitting that land bridge. If they do that, there's a distinct possibility that the Russian defenses across the board would start to collapse in the mainland part of Ukraine, and collapse really quite quickly. That would cause the Ukrainians some real difficulties if that happened, because they need to make sure that in the bite-sized chunks that they take back, that they then can generate sufficient combat power to secure those chunks, make sure that they're not leaving themselves exposed to a Russian counterattack and spreading their ability to defend themselves too thinly, whilst they generate another maneuver capability to take the next bite-sized chunk back. What the Ukrainians, I think, have been doing the whole way through this operation is giving us a masterclass in the planning and execution of complex all arms and combined military operations, whilst re-equipping, retraining, and redeploying your total military force as they're in contact with the enemy. That is something that I don't think the British military or even the US military would have the ability to do today, and they're giving us a huge masterclass in this. There are going to be some fantastic lessons that are going to come out on the way we need to be configured in the future. So what's next? What's the end? Well, I sort of talked that through. I think the best that we'll see this year is the Ukrainians taking one or two big chunks back out of the areas that Russia has captured on mainland Ukraine. One of the, if they manage to split that land bridge and the Russian defenses do collapse, then there's an outside possibility that the Ukrainians might be able to take all of their territory back again and do that. And then we come into the Crimea piece. Crimea will be a difficult problem for them to solve. And it's the creation of that bridgehead onto Crimea that they can sustain. If they can do that, they can keep Crimea isolated from Russia with the long-range systems that are being provided. But it is how that will stimulate Vladimir Putin and his potential responses with it. I don't think they're going to be in a position to do that this year. I think we're into 2024 at the earliest for the Ukrainians to consider the recapture of Crimea. But I think the end state will be that recapture of Crimea, and then we get the collapse of Vladimir Putin, that kingpin coming out of the center, and the implications that'll have. And we have to remember that Russia itself is not a single country. It is a Russian federation of 22 little statelets. A large number of those statelets are along other borders where people would be concerned, in particular the Chinese border. And the statelets that are around the Chinese border tend to be heavy Muslim population. Those Muslim populations are very closely aligned to the Uyghur people across the other side of the Chinese border. And we have to question whether the Chinese would sit and wait for little statelets that they would consider destabilizing popping up on the other side of the border, or whether they would consider going across and carrying out peacekeeping operations or peace enforcement operations into those as Russia starts to fall apart. Of course, between now and then, geopolitically, China will have bought most of Russia, will have bought most of the natural resources that are coming out. That's why Xi Jinping is sitting on the fence at the moment and not condemning what's going on. He wants that economic link to buy everything that he can. He'll tell Putin he'll support him in any way he can, but provided he can buy those areas of natural resources exactly the way he's done in China and across Africa. That's the end of the formal bit of the presentation, and now up to discussion and questions.
Thank you, Philip. I mean, there was a lot there. And just full disclosure, Philip and I had a chat last night before we came on to go through a few things. Those of you that don't know me, my name is Tess Butler and I'm a director of Fight Club. And I spent most of the 90s in the Soviet Union and Russia. I did a degree in Russian and Soviet studies and spent time in Ukraine as well. So obviously I have like a long invested interest, and it was 1990 and I was in Leningrad the first time. So you're not the only one here with grey hair, Philip. Look, thank you very much for that. Now, Daniel, I noticed that you had your hand up for quite a while. Did Philip answer your question as we were going through, or do you want to ask something now?
Oh no, it's kind of as we kind of moved past the topic. Well, I put my hand up originally when we were talking about like tanks and the general pipeline of Eastern Western equipment. And I was wondering if you'd cover it when we got onto the bit about the upcoming spring offensives. I've seen a lot of speculation that the pushing for an increase in Western equipment, particularly armored vehicles, and weapon systems and just systems in general that obviously require quite a bit of user training. The speculation that I've kind of seen and makes sense to me is that it's not for now, it's so that the Ukrainians can commit. So say, for example, they know they're getting 100 Leopard 2s and Challenger 2s in the next 6 months. They know they can commit more of their operational reserves now, knowing they have more equipment coming down in the pipeline. Does that track with what you've seen and kind of speculated?
Yeah, that fits. What we also have to remember, and what I didn't touch on this, is the importance of the information operations that are going on across the board. You know, the Russians are past masters at it. There's a doctrine of maskirovka, masking, that they deploy at every opportunity. And if I had more time, I'd go into the information operations. But the Ukrainians, with their old Soviet background, are just as good at it. And the way Zelensky has been playing the West, and he has been playing the West for his own ends, and it's right and proper that he should do so. He's giving Western leaders a masterclass in leadership under the most difficult of circumstances. But the Western equipment coming in will have a massive impact on, from an information perspective, on the morale of senior Russian commanders, because they know how good it is, and a massive impact on the troops on the ground. They know how the old Russian equipment works, and they now know what it's like to suffer bombardments from HIMARS and 155mm artillery and everything else. And that psychological impact is fracturing the people who are already fractured because they don't know quite why they're there and they don't have the same motivation. So there's a big piece to that. And I think when it comes to the Ukrainians and it comes to counterattack, a question, and I did some task organization in my own mind whenever we committed 14 Challenger 2 tanks, which is a squadron of tanks. But then thinking about some of the other stuff that was being committed, if you had a squadron Challenger 2 tanks and you put 2 companies of Bradleys with it, you've got effective and armored infantry regiment that's there, light one, but the Bradleys are very effective against any Russian armor that's there, and that's a big punch. You then put behind that punch 2 other wheeled armored or mechanized formations, taking the French AMX-10 and the Striker wheeled vehicle, and you've got a punch to get through the Russian defensive lines, which aren't very strong indeed, and you've then got the ability with 2 other regiments to exploit out through that very rapidly indeed, using wheels and push the Russians back. That would have a massive shock effect. You can defend your flanks with your Russian tanks, your Russian equipment, all the rest of it. There's a number of things that the Ukrainians can do very effectively with a relatively small task organization of Western equipment, knowing full well that there's even more of it coming along the line. And if they have success with one bit of that, again, the information, the psychological impact that will have on the Russians as they know more is coming will be significant, and that pressure will be reflected back up into Putin. Does that answer your question?
No, yeah, absolutely. I think it makes perfect sense. And I just wanted to agree that I was involved in a bit of information ops myself when I was in, and I do agree that Ukraine is a masterclass of, I think we'll be studying it for decades to come, and there's probably already people who are smarter than me and have more letters after their names, who are already writing doctrine and everything else, and looking at that. And I think it was people calling Zelensky the Churchill of the 21st century. I don't think it's too far off. Well,
you just have to look at the way he addresses international audiences. You know, when he went into Parliament, you know, he was Churchillian. You know, he was playing the British with all the stereotypical niceties that you do. You use afternoon tea analogies and everything else in his latest speech. When he went to the United States, his speech was tuned to American history and American culture. When he went into Germany, it was tweaked to pull the heartstrings of the Germans. He is whoever speechwriter is a complete and utter master at this, and he's a master at delivering it as well.
Well, I agree actually, Philip. And one of the things I was going to draw out from all of this, because it's about what can we take out of this into our wargaming and what we would put into wargaming in the future to actually help with predicting future ops and future missions, is a few things. So first of all, it is all about people, you know, whether it's the leaders, the culture, the data we're getting, and the training and resilience of all of these teams. What I found interesting was you bringing out that there's groupthink about the fact that a lot of senior people in the West didn't think this was going to happen, when, you know, a lot of me and my friends who'd lived out in Russia were like, oh no, it's totally going to happen. But then also the groupthink on the other side, that they were going to be in and out in a week, and everything was going to be over. And this is the danger of groupthink. And I think this is one of the things that we need to bring into our wargaming team, into Fight Club especially, so that when we're actually wargaming and game designing, that we have different voices and different perspectives into that game to ensure that we have the widest possible outputs as well. I'd like to know your thoughts on that.
Absolutely, hugely. I remember in Kosovo, as we were preparing to go into Kosovo, I used to sit of an evening and write an assessment myself. I'd look at what was going on in the negotiations that we were having with Milosevic and the Serb side, and I'd write a little output piece called Mr. Milosevic's Diaries, and I'd fire that into General Sir Mike Jackson of an evening bit, and I put myself in Milosevic's shoes as he's going to bed with his glass of milk and his pajamas on, writing his diary up as to what happened during the day, and the interactions that were going, and look at it from his perspective. And you look at our military structures, you look at the military setups and all the rest of it. We're very good at having tick box diversity. So, you know, the military will turn around and say, yes, we are diverse because we've ticked this, we've got this policy, we've got that, we've got all the rest of it. But when you examine, is there real diversity in there, and therefore real diversity of thinking, is there bollocks? You know, it is one of the biggest massive groupthink organizations that there is going. And you look at the pressure that's put on people who think outside the box, who say something differently, who are frowned upon by senior people, and a lot of people being absolutely petrified of saying anything outside the box because it's OJAR time and they don't want to embarrass themselves. If you don't get that sort of wider thinking piece, and if you look at society and look at the societies who are involved in conflict and look at everything else, diversity is normality. The military is not normal in any way, shape or form. And we need to be thinking of things from that normality perspective. So that, you know, that isn't just race, sex, or anything else. It brings in all of the different aspects, so all the different tisms that are out there, autistic spectrum and everything else from a diverse perspective. And you need to be in a position to think through all of that. And this is where the wargaming support to military operations, the red teaming support, the operational analysis support, and everything else that's going in must act as the conscience for the commanders. You know, I, as an intelligence officer, tried to act as the conscience for my commanders. You know, I turned around and Headquarters ARC had just come back from Afghanistan. I was briefing in Afghanistan. I hadn't been out there with them, and there was my 1-star and above highly classified briefing I gave on a weekly basis. It was my 2nd or 3rd week in the Ark, and we'd picked up indications that the Taliban were changing their tactics and were going to go to more improvised explosive devices rather than what they'd been doing until then, which was more conventional military type, infantry type operations. But they couldn't sustain the casualties that were there. And we got some very highly classified intelligence that the training had been going on across the border in Iran, and they were moving their experts across, and they were going to start deploying them. As I started to brief this, the then Chief of Staff of the Ark stood up. He threw his file of facts at me across the thing. He said, "Ingram, you've only just arrived here. I've been there, you haven't. I'm not having any more defeatist intelligence briefs from you. That will never happen." And he stormed out. Groupthink.
Groupthink. Bazia, you've been contributing in the chat a lot this evening. Thank you very much. You've raised your hand. Would you like to come and contribute?
Colonel Ingram, it was truly a world journey, like wonderful summary, and
thank you.
It would have taken me many years to ever come up, and hopefully I will be able to do it one day. Did the Russians really outsmart, or did they scam? I use the word scam deliberately because in the sense that until a certain point, they always seem to play nice, play by the rules and so forth. And so just, was it a scam or outsmarting? Thank you.
Have the Russians ever played by the rules? They work on so many different levels, and they always keep the information game going the whole way through. It's always deny, even whenever they're blatantly doing something. I'll go back to, you saw in my opening show reel commentary on the Salisbury poisonings and on the Skripal poisonings. Sergei Skripal wasn't attacked because he was #1 on the assassination list from Vladimir Putin. He was attacked because he lived in Salisbury. He was attacked because he lived in Salisbury because Vladimir Putin wanted an outlet to send a message to a couple of his oligarchs who were being a little bit dissenting, and it happened exactly 14 days before his presidential election, and he wanted a greater majority, and he needed somewhere to send that message, but he needed to be somewhere where he could plausibly deny it. And the first thing that he came out with was, "It wasn't us, it must have escaped from the British chemical warfare establishment of Porton Down." And he was even happier whenever he saw the leader of the opposition in Parliament stand up and say, "Can you please prove to me, Prime Minister, that it didn't escape from the British chemical warfare establishment in Porton Down?" Vladimir Putin, I imagine, was sitting behind his very large oak desk in Moscow with a tall glass of the best Russian crystal, of best Russian vodka over ice, with a big white cat on his knee, stroking it, going, "I've done my job." And it's the same the whole way through. Yes, he bluffed us, but he also bluffed himself in many ways, I think, and that's the important bit. He didn't see his own bluffing.
Thanks, Philip. We haven't got very long left, so I'm going to ask people to keep their questions super short, and we're going to do super short answers so we can get through more. Okay. So, Anthony, you had your hand raised.
Hello. Thanks very much. I'll try and keep it short, but I am dyslexic, so I do get stuck on my words. Thank you very much, Philip. So, 2 questions and one sort of open one for more for the club. And for full disclosure, I've also spent time living in Russia. My first son is in Russia now, and I've not seen him for over a year. But anyway, that's aside. Anyway, so first question is sanctions. Very quickly, do you think the Russian people should be sanctioned, not just the elite, so the message gets through about behavior and everything that's been in the news? Question 1. Second question is more of a historical question, and obviously I would reference Alec Guinness's speech in Dr. Zhivago. For a revolution a la carte 1917, how many dead Russians or wounded would it take, do you think, for that to happen? And then for the final open question for wargaming is Kaliningrad, could it be blockaded without invading or any attacks? Just say, we blockade this place, get out of Ukraine. And that's for the club. Thank you very much.
Okay, very quickly, taking your second question first, casualties. It was the bodies coming back from Afghanistan and the mothers of the soldiers that put pressure on the Russian government at the time that caused the Russians to finally make a decision to withdraw from Afghanistan. There have been many more bodies coming back from Ukraine. and the full detail haven't come out. The majority of the Russian military that are deployed in Ukraine are not from the European parts. They're not from Moscow, St. Petersburg or elsewhere. They're from the very outlying little parts of the state where there's possibly one television. Literacy levels are at the lowest in some parts of the world. The only feed that they get is what the state is feeding them is in what's happening. The information about people getting killed or wounded or anything else takes weeks and weeks and weeks to get through, if it does actually get through. And it's much easier for the Russian state to control the people that are out there and control the real understanding of the casualties that they're suffering. That comes into your first point, the sanctioning against the people. I don't think it would really affect the people and affect the decision making. The sanctions are hitting that inner sanctum bit of an inner circle for Vladimir Putin. And it's doing two things. It's putting pain and pressure on them so that they will at some stage try and put pain and pressure on Putin to get some way of easing the sanctions. They've managed to shift their businesses and are getting money from Xi Jinping and India and Pakistan and elsewhere. But what the sanctions have also done is caused a much larger global issue to be put back in the shelf, because Xi Jinping was sitting there watching what the Western reaction would be in Ukraine, and he was going to work out what he was going to do with Taiwan then. And if we hadn't hit them economically, and the thing that drives China is economics, because he saw what we did economically so fast, that Xi Jinping will have gone, oh, we can't afford that, we're not going to do this, and will have told his generals to put the invasion of Taiwan plans back on the shelf and keep them there for a little while.
I'd had that on my bingo card for this evening, which is economic sanctions and putting those into wargaming financing. Anthony, thank you very much for your question. We've got a couple of answers about the Kaliningrad question in the chat. And I'd just like to say I'm genuinely sorry that you haven't been able to see your son for a year. I can't imagine how tough that is. John, you've responded to the blockade of Kaliningrad question, and you've got your hand raised. Would you like to contribute?
Sure, yeah. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
I've got one question about the Special Operations Forces activities on the first day of the war. I'm sure as an old Cold War warrior, he'll recognise certain very strong similarities to what happens in Red Storm Rising of all things. Yeah. Should what happened make us think again, recalibrate the effectiveness of, broadly speaking, strategic commando operations on the first couple of days of the war? Because I know the Russians historically have put great store, great resources into it without necessarily having a lot to show for it. Really appreciate your thought on that.
Yeah, 100% I think we should do, but the Russians have got it wrong. The dilemma that the Russians have is they're better special forces, and they're more military special forces, the GRU, the first directorate, Russian military intelligence that works to the Ministry of Defense. They have the Spetsnaz and all their specially trained individuals, all the rest of it. The special forces that have led in this operation have been the FSB, and they're more, in their approach. They're not as well trained militarily. They haven't got the same sort of ideas and same sort of capabilities. And this is where I think the Russians got it wrong. However, looking at, taking a question and looking elsewhere, one of the big successes that is coming out of this whole operation are what I say or describe as the Second World War SOE tactics that the Ukrainians are managing to show and carry out interdiction operations behind Russian lines and across the border inside Russia. There isn't a day that goes by where we don't see something catching fire. There today massive reports of different railway control boxes across Belarus and elsewhere catching fire mysteriously. We've seen airfields catching fire and burning, and ammunition dumps burning inside Crimea and elsewhere. And the Ukrainians are running some fantastic special operations executive type operations throughout the whole of the AOR and the Russian rear area. And that's a big lesson that, yes, we need strategic commando.
Thank you for that, Philip. We've only got a couple of minutes left. So if you've got questions for Philip, please put them in the chat now, and we'll see if Philip's kind enough to answer those offline. I've got a couple of calls out for Fight Club as well. So we are running a wargaming festival at DSET this year, which is the 5th and 6th of June. The whole conference is 5th to the 8th. We're looking for people to come and bring your games. Bring your games and show them off in the room. We've got 40 different militaries coming, around 1,000 people, hopefully over the whole week. And we'd very much like you guys to come and show off your games to a whole new audience as well. And then the second day is going to be a wargaming conference where we're going to have specific themes. We've got academia showing off their development of wargaming and taking into account all of these new lessons learned, game design, hybrid wargaming, looking at digital and manual together, pros, cons, all of that stuff. So if you'd like to get involved, just go to the DSET website. Also, we're running the Serious Games Showcase and Challenge, and we're looking for assessors. So you get to come and play games and say if you like them or not. I mean, that's not tough. And 2, we'd like you to submit games. So if you've built a learning game for any learning point, one of the games last year was learning physics aspects with farting dogs in space. Anything is a learning game almost. Please get them submitted, or if you know someone has built a game, get them to submit it. The winner goes to Orlando and it will be hosted by the Serious Games Showcase Challenge USA. So it's awesome. So those are my 2 calls for action. Philip, thank you so much for your time in both preparing, rehearsing yesterday and coming on this evening. And yeah, it's been a blast.